make this thing work. Is that working? Thank you very much, Jane Francis. It's quite a daunting task, actually, to speak to the David Hume Institute in Hume City, Hume's University, in the building that bears his name, on a subject he would have relished and tackled much, much better than I can. I think I like everything about David Hume, except perhaps the silly hat in the Alan Ramsay portrait. Everything else. But what I particularly like about him is his hatred for Rousseau. It seems to me, I mean, he said of himself in the little book he wrote, Hume, on his deathbed, that he was of cheerful humour, capable of attachment, but little susceptible of enmity. Little susceptible of enmity. That was one of his very few lies, because his volcanic row with Rousseau had demonstrated that he could spot a shocking Frenchman when he saw one. I like very much what Voltaire said about him, by the way. I have nothing against Frenchmen. But Rousseau, honestly, Rousseau, all that social contract drivel, all that benign state of nature stuff, which Hobbes had demolished long before, and correctly so. Rousseau was a clever ass. He's the sort of chap who believes in referenda. But we are where we are, and we have to talk about Brexit. And I thought I would say something about what the House of Lords has been up to in the last 6 weeks, which has caused the Daily Mail to call us dinosaurs in ermine, which I rather like, and call for our abolition. I want to look at 3 of the amendments we made in particular, and I want to touch on our failure to solve the impasse over Brexit and devolution. I want to look ahead to the autumn, and I intend to risk some predictions about how the real parliamentary battle then, because all that's going on now is a sham battle, the real parliamentary battle in the autumn may pan out, and all this, and about how all this might end. But I think I need first to start by declaring my interests, as one does in the House of Lords, with a sort of apologia pro vita sua, showing where I stand and why. As Jane Francis said, I was Mrs. Thatcher's negotiator in Brussels, John Major's negotiator in Brussels, John Major's ambassador in Washington, Tony Blair, John Major's appointment, but Tony Blair's permanent secretary in the Foreign Office in London. In my time in Brussels, 4 of the 5 key issues on which the European Union was working were issues where the UK was either the original instigator or the principal proponent of the policy. I leave on one side, obviously, monetary union, where though we had singularized ourselves away from monetary union, our position was clearly understood, and it was understood that we wanted to see monetary union succeed. The other 4 central policies of the EU in these days, when David Edward was in the court in Luxembourg, and available at the end of the telephone when I didn't know what the hell was going on in Brussels and was able to call David for advice. The principal policies going on were enlargement, which was a policy invented in London and in Copenhagen. The single market, which was a policy invented by Margaret Thatcher, Arthur Cockfield, and Jacques Delors. Concluding the Uruguay round, which led to the formation of the World Trade Organization, which was a policy strongly supported by the Dutch, the Germans, the British, and the Danes, with considerable opposition from Southern Europe, particularly from France, and trying to bring to an end the civil wars in the ex-Yugoslavia, where the Spanish and the British and the French were at the forefront. It was rather a proud experience representing Britain in Brussels back then. We were undoubtedly the best prepared for any negotiation in the Council, partly because we had the strongest position in the Commission. There were 7 Directors General, 6 Directors General, and the Secretary General of the Commission were British. The French had 4, the Germans had 4. And these were in the good old days when appointments in the Commission were run on an 18th century system, and the British permanent representative was able to exercise a degree of pistonnage. Unfortunately, merit was introduced as a criterion later. We certainly had the best coordination system in London. It was exhausting, the permanent representative. He had to be in London all day every Friday, having been in Kerr in Brussels all day every Thursday, and sometimes on Wednesday as well. But we were very well prepared, and we enjoyed ourselves because we thought what we were doing was something that seemed to us to be worth doing, and where, on the whole, we succeeded. When I went to Washington, I found access to the President, who was Clinton, very easy, and I found the Hill and the administration very responsive, curiously responsive to British arguments. It didn't take me very long to work out that the reason they wanted to listen to me was not the beauty of the British arguments, but their understanding or their perception that if they did a deal with the British would be able to swing the European Union behind that deal. They listened to us not because of the beauty of our arguments, but because of the weight of our position in Brussels. Commonwealth governments then looked to us to secure preferential trade access to the European Union for their trade, and usually with French help, we often did. The Japanese were already starting to see us as their landing place in Europe, because they were well aware that it was the British who persuaded Jacques Delors that a Nissan made in Sunderland in these days, with a considerable amount of Japanese content, much less now, was an EU car and should be freely tradable throughout the European Union. The Koreans knew that we were the proponents of the free trade agreement with Korea, which eventually was secured well after my time. We had the feeling that we were creating jobs in Britain and opportunities for British exporters abroad, raising living standards here and strengthening relationships around the world. And I think we were. I think I was extraordinarily lucky. I think I held 3 top jobs at a time, but coincidentally, I held 3 top jobs at a time when we were enjoying greater global influence than at any time since the Second World War. That time is past, and I am very sad about that. The battles that had raged in my service in the 60s and the 70s, 50s, 60s and 70s, between the Blue Water diplomatists, the transatlanticists, the Commonwealth School, and the European realists who thought we must correct as soon as we could the mistake we'd made at Messina. That battle was over, long over, by the time I was permanent secretary, because the service had come to understand that it was a false dichotomy, that the 2 policies were mutually reinforcing, that there was a synergy there. So naturally, I'm mortified that we should throw all that away. Throw away our ability to help friends around the world, throw away our ability to generate jobs at home, throw away our ability to create or help create a Europe capable of standing up to the superpowers of China and America. I feel very sorry for my successors in the public service, obliged to work for policies which many, perhaps most of them, know can only make our country weaker and our people poorer. People work best when they believe in what they're doing. And I'm still a bit shocked by the insouciance and the overconfidence of a Prime Minister ready for reasons of short-term political party expedience to risk all we had, and when the bet was lost, strolling off into the sunset, still seemingly insouciant. I feel much more sympathy for his successor, left with that very difficult inheritance. Of course it was a mistake to box herself in from the start with rashly drawn red lines. Of course it was unwise to start the 2-year clock with first determining what it was that we wanted to secure and securing the country's support for that aim. course, it's absurd that we still have no cabinet definition of where it is that we want to end up. Absurd for us and very frustrating for our partners in the 27 in Brussels. But the core of the problem that she faces is not of her making. She inherited it. I'm sure she knows, though clearly she cannot say, the simple truth that there is no form of Brexit that is as good as no Brexit. I am convinced that is the case. I am convinced that the majority in the cabinet believe that is the case. I'm convinced that the majority in the Commons believe that is the case. What we're doing is self-harming, and the best course would be to stop. You'll recognize that I was a diplomat. It's the understatement that gives it away, really. My model, actually, as a diplomat, was Gladstone. There was an occasion when Gladstone, as Prime Minister, had to receive the French ambassador who had come to tell him that France did not agree with the British diplomatic initiative. I know you find that hard to believe, but that was a long time ago. The French ambassador slightly overdid it, and in explaining how sad he was that he's having to carry out these instructions, he ended up by saying how Anglophile he was. Had I not been born French, I would have wished to be born English. And there was a long pause while Mr. Gladstone looked at him and then said, how very strange. Had I not been born English, I would have wished to be born English. It's diplomacy. Now for the Lords, the dinosaurs in ermine. We are a revising chamber, and the Commons rightly rules the roost. The Commons legislates much faster than we do, with time limits, which mean that many issues and many amendments are never explored or discussed, and with the government usually sure of a majority in the lobbies. The Commons does, however, recognise that the more ponderous procedures of the Lords do some good from time to time. The government don't have a majority in the Lords, and the Lords tends to listen to the arguments. And I am one of a block of independents who, in fact, can be, from time to time, quite influential, and were in the debates on the EU withdrawal bill. In general, 90%, more than 90%, of amendments made by the House of Lords, with its meticulous, ponderous, boring procedures, 90% of these amendments are accepted by the Commons when the bill comes back to the Commons. I don't think that will necessarily be the case with this bill. We spent 20 long days on it, long days through to midnight, after midnight. The government made 221 changes to it, to the bill, when they had heard the arguments in the House of Lords. Perhaps they were going to change it anyway, but it sounded in many cases as if they genuinely had been listening to the arguments, recognizing which way the wind was blowing, recognizing they didn't have the votes, and they moved. And on 15 issues, they didn't want to move, and the House of Lords overruled them and outvoted them and made the changes. So the bill which is on its way back to the Commons is a very different bill from the bill that came up from the Commons. I don't know when the Commons are going to hear it. It's not in the business for next week or the week after that. It looks to me as if the government are not sure that they have the votes to defeat some of the amendments made by the Lords. And it may be that they are waiting till close to the June European Council before they put it back, although that means holding up 4 other bills that are lined up behind it. Maybe they're waiting to do it in the shadow of the June European Council, just before, when it will be easier to argue with Tory rebels that you can't send the Prime Minister naked into the negotiating chamber, you can't stab her in the back, you can't rebel on this come-on vote. I don't know. The government aren't rushing to find out whether they have the votes. In one respect, we certainly failed as a legislature. I'm very sorry that despite the efforts of James Mackay and David Hope and a lot of better constitutional experts than me, we did not crack the devolution impasse. To my amateur eye, the breach of the 1998 settlement is now less blatant following the amendment which the government have made, and it is a compromise that satisfied the Welsh, but as we saw last week, it doesn't satisfy the Scottish Assembly. I still find the government's arguments for a temporary freeze less than compelling. Yes, of course, we need to maintain a UK single market. But that doesn't preclude a degree of diversity, as anyone who drives across America looking at differential sales taxes can detect. And arguably, devolution means acceptance of a degree of diversity. There's nothing inherently odd about diversity. Of course, it must be diversity within some kind of framework, but what do we mean by a framework, and why should it be only one government, not the four governments which decide? I'm also uneasy about the Scottish Order in Council proposal, because it can be presented, perhaps misrepresented, as intended to give Scotland a veto over application of regulation in not just in Scotland, but in the other three parliaments as well. And that seems to me to be, if that is the case, that could be a bridge too far. But I think we are very close to a very serious constitutional crisis, and the Supreme Court will hear the case against the Continuity Bill on the 23rd and 24th of July. I think it would have been very good to have settled this before it goes to court. I'm not a constitutional expert, I'm not a lawyer, I can't address the substance, but as an ex-negotiator, I draw two conclusions. First, to quote Ruth Davidson on Monday, quote, "Devolution has transformed the UK's political structures. Government must develop better practices to ensure this constitutional reality is properly recognised." She's talking about the London government. I agree with her. But I think it's actually worse than that. I think the London government has let the existing mechanisms get rusty from disuse. I think the Joint Ministerial Committee, which was invented in 1998, has met far too irregularly. I understand one gap under this government ran for 7 months. A lot of papers and positions have been produced with no consultation at all with the devolved governments. The EU withdrawal bill is an example. There was another example last week. A London paper sent to Brussels set out a wish list for participation from outside in a number of organizations like Europol, Eurojust, the European Arrest Warrant, the Schengen Information System, a host of security and judicial cooperation mechanisms. That was sent to Brussels without being seen in Edinburgh, even though in respect of cooperation with these institutions, in Scotland, responsibility rests entirely with the Scottish government. And the Home Office in London deals with England, and the Ministry of Justice in London deals with England. So that seems to me to be a flagrant example of a lack of consultation, which is probably substantively damaging, but is certainly atmospherically damaging. It is not easy to see how to maintain a close relationship if you don't go through the basic courtesies of diplomacy. So it seems to me that one lesson to draw from this impasse is that London needs to display a bit more diplomacy and a bit less discourtesy. Even-handed as always, I'd like to address the reason why I think, or a reason why I think we in the Lords failed to crack it. And that's because the SNP don't help us. There is nobody in the upper house of the UK legislature who can authoritatively explain the positions of the Scottish government. The Welsh suffer from no such disadvantage. I think it is seriously damaging to the Scottish government, to the legislature in London, and to the interests of Scotland that the governing party in Scotland refuses to send any representative to the upper house of the UK legislature. Now, I think the last few weeks have demonstrated that that is damaging to Scotland's interests. Now, of course, the Lords is a very curious place. It's far too big, it's too old, it's too male, it's too stale, it's too pale, and it's not terribly democratic. I have to admit that. But it is actually trying to reform all that, and I think its present reform procedures, which it has approved, and which do not require legislation, I think they may go through. They would correct that. They would reduce our size by applying a 2 out for 1 in rule. They would go for fixed terms, and they would mean that new arrivals came in proportion to votes gained or seats gained, I can't remember, at the 2 most recent previous general elections. Now, if that happens, and the SNP refuse to take their quota of seats, there will be empty seats in the House of Lords, seats that should be filled by Scots. And that would be completely absurd, surely. So my message and I said I want to be really even-handed, my message to the Scottish government is it's time the SNP stopped being stuck on this arcane doctrine and got stuck in Westminster. They do in the House of Commons. They're very well represented in the House of Commons. In the House of Lords, they emulate Sinn Féin and refuse to be represented. Why? I don't think it makes sense. I told you I was a diplomat. Actually, I can do real diplomacy. Before I went to Washington, I studied how to be an ambassador in Washington and found the memoirs of Jules Jusserand, who was the French ambassador in Washington in Teddy Roosevelt's time, and was not very like me. He was a brilliant linguist and a very precise, perhaps rather prissy man, extremely concerned about being well-dressed and what wines to serve and so on. But he was a very good ambassador, and he got very close to Roosevelt. Walking by the Potomac one summer day with the president, he was alarmed. The president took off all his clothes and jumped in the Potomac, shouting, "Come swimming." Jusserand writes in his memoirs, "I had a moment of doubt. How would this play in Paris?" But I realized my job was to keep close to the president, which he did, and I took off my clothes. However, in case there were ladies present, I kept on my gloves. There's diplomacy for you. Now, for the key Lords' amendments to the bill, I'll start, because I'm a modest man, with the one I proposed on customs union, which carried by a majority of 123, and the one on single market, which carried by 27, even though it was opposed by both government and opposition front benches. I think the possible acceptability of some sort of EEA arrangement is now a live issue in the Labour Party, and it is clear that in the Conservative Party there is real doubt about whether the votes can be found to knock out my amendment. They are soft amendments, both of them. They merely require the government to put on the table in Brussels the idea of forming a customs union between the UK and the European Union, and the idea of having an EEA-type arrangement. We can't go hard. We can't require that they negotiate such things because there's another party in the negotiation. But we can ask them to explore, to try, to have a go. And I think the Prime Minister made a very serious mistake when she took both the single market and customs union off the table in her party conference speech back in 2016. If we leave the EU, we can't stay in its customs union, but we ask the government to explore setting up a new one between us and the EU. We can't say we'd like to muscle our way into the EEA, but actually it would be a different EEA if we joined it. It would be a very different EEA. And interestingly, the Norwegian government last week came out with a change of position saying that it would welcome it if we did join. The CBI and the TUC supports both options, both customs union and an EEA-type membership of the single market. A customs union would solve the biggest and costliest Brexit problem for manufacturing industry, which is certification of complex rules of origin checks at frontiers, which are completely incompatible with modern supply chains, closely integrated and just-in-time delivery of components. The biggest and threat to exporters of goods and services, which is a divergent regulation, would be dealt with by an EEA-type country membership of the single market. Together, the two options would remove the need for a hard Irish frontier. And I should add that I see no other negotiable way of avoiding a hard Irish frontier. Cabinet is considering two, both of which the 27 have already rejected. Cabinet has also now said, if the press are to be believed, to be considering a third, which is simply kicking the can down the road and saying we'll think of a technical solution by, say, 2022, 23, 25. Meanwhile, we'll behave as if we were in the customs union, therefore not have a frontier. But I don't think the EU will buy that. I don't think the Irish will buy that. I wouldn't if I were them. Now is their moment of maximum leverage, and why should they trust us to come up with a solution 5 years down the line when we can't think of it or define what it would be now? I'm saying something quite worrying here, because I think it is the case that the EU will stick with Ireland. And if there is no solution found to the Irish frontier problem, then, and we refuse to go for the fallback that we agreed in December because the DUP don't like it, in that situation, I think there will be no withdrawal agreement. The other two bits, citizens' rights and the money settlement, will fall if the Irish bit falls. So it is far from certain that there will be a deal, and if there isn't a deal, the reason will probably be intransigence about Ireland. There is a downside to a customs union, I freely accept. Mr. Rees-Mogg isn't entirely wrong about vassal state. We would not be able, if we had a customs union with the European Union, to go and do free trade deals with third countries around the world. I think we would be able to secure some sort of consultative mechanism with the EU about what its and our external trade policies should be. How substantive that consultative mechanism would be, I have no idea. It would be more substantive than the EEA arrangement for Norwegian consultation on single market law, that's for sure. But I don't know how big it would be, how strong it would be, and we will never know unless the government agree to find out, which is what the Lords have asked them to do. I am quite sure, however, that there is no chance that new trade deals with third countries could possibly compensate for the new frictions in trade with the EU 27, which we shall have if we don't have single market membership, country membership, and we don't have a customs union. The Treasury say third country deals would boost GDP by about something between 0.2% and 0.7%. Whereas breaking with the single market and customs union would mean a hit of 5%. In other words, losses exceed gains by a factor of 10. NIASR say trade with the rest of the world would rise by less than 5%, and total trade, net of that, would fall by between 22 and 30%. Of course, these guys are experts, so ignore them. The country is fed up with experts. Let's stick to facts. The fact is we sell more to Germany than to the entire Commonwealth. The fact is that we sell more to Ireland than to all the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. More to Ireland than. We sell more to Switzerland than we do to Canada, though the population is 3 times as big. Why? Because they're closer. It's an ineluctable rule when you're dealing with trade in goods that trade halves when distance doubles. Ineluctable. It's always the case. There's another rule, which is size matters. Trade diplomacy is old-fashioned mercantilist arm wrestling. We will have a huge job retaining the current access we have with the 65 countries with whom the EU has preferential trade agreements. We will have a huge job retaining that for us when we're not in the EU, and all we're offering is access to a market of 65 million rather than access to a market of 500 million. We are offering less, and therefore these people around the world, or some of them will say, we should get less, or we should offer more, we should drop our standards, we should reduce our tariffs further, we should have fewer environmental standards, we should, whatever. Trade diplomacy is old-fashioned, mercantilist arm wrestling. The fact is the Germans sell 5 times as much to the Chinese as we do, and the French sell more to America than we do now. So it can't be the shackles of the EU that's holding us back. The fault, dear Boris, is not in the blue flag with the gold stars, but in ourselves. There is something, a productivity problem that we need to cure nationally. And it won't magically cure itself through the act of Brexit. The fact is that President Trump isn't exactly a free trader. And there will be no sentimental special relationship, sweetheart deals going. Actually, there never have been. It's always been mercantilist arm wrestling with the United States. And that's fair enough. Their job is to look after their interests. Our job is to look after ours. But size matters. There are a lot more of them than there are of us, 5 times as many. I'll spare you the hormone-fed beef and the chlorine-washed chicken and all that, and the US farmers' ambitions for the National Health Service. The fact is that Dr. Fox, for all his air miles, has produced nothing at all. And it's not his fault. There aren't magical new deals to be done out there. The sooner that fox is shot, the better. Please don't misunderstand me. So I personally, the downside to customs union is you can't do these magical new deals. I say no great loss, because there aren't any magical new deals to do. Enough about trade. Now for the exciting bit. The most important Lord's Amendment to the EU withdrawal bill spelt out how parliamentary approval of the outcome of the negotiations is to be obtained. Up to now, the government have maintained that if there is no deal, there will be nothing for Parliament to approve. We just leave, and there need be no vote. And if there is a deal, Parliament can buy that deal or reject that deal, in which case there's no deal, and we leave with no deal. Hobson's choice, this deal or no deal. And since no deal would obviously be disaster, with no legal basis for continuing cooperation, no tariff-free trade, no access to EU agencies or programs, no access to Horizon 2020, no access to Erasmus, and since presumably, if we had no deal, we'd be paying no money and we'd be leaving without settling our debts. and therefore would be heading for the Court of Arbitration or somewhere. Because the 27 would be whistling for their money, as the Foreign Secretary so elegantly put it. Of course, if it's Hobson's choice, this deal or no deal, Parliament will approve this deal, however bad it is. So the government thought they had Parliament in a box. They only had to come to Parliament if there was a deal, and Parliament would have no choice but to approve that deal. If this amendment survives in the Commons, we're out of that box. New Clause 10 sets up a genuinely meaningful vote, probably for November. Could be December. What then will be the options for Parliament? It's getting even more exciting, I promise. I see 6 options, and I'll try to mark your card. First, still the bookie's favourite. Parliament buys the deal, allows the government to take us out on the 29th of March 2019. But I see 2 snags. Unless the Prime Minister moves on her red lines, particularly a single market and customs union, it'll be a hard Brexit, and I'm not at all sure now that there is a majority in the Commons for a hard Brexit. The rebels on the Conservative side are more now than they were 6 months ago, and I think that number will continue to grow. It will also be a blind Brexit, not just hard but blind, because the negotiation on the future framework for the relationship between the UK and the EU we've left has not started. It hasn't started because the government have made no proposals. The EU made their proposal in March, when at the European Council, the 27 approved the mandate for Barnier to conduct this negotiation. There has been no negotiation. There have been no rounds between Barnier and Davies since March, because the British government don't have a position, and they seem to be unable to get a position until they can decide where they stand on customs union, which is clearly proving very difficult. So it's going to be a blind Brexit. We're not going to know by November, other than there'll be some sort of political declaration in which we will promise it will be bespoke and comprehensive and unique and special and all sorts of things. We will not be able to tell what exactly it is going to be. The transition will be a transition to nowhere, because the details of the future relationship, possibly if the government gets its way and the big boys let Ireland down, I don't think this will happen, but possibly won't even be anything about the Irish frontier. Everything will be for negotiation after we leave, after March 2019. Now, I think that prospect might create more rebels, including possibly the DUP. So it is the bookie's favourite, but I would like you to look a little further down the bookie's board. Second option is the lemming option. This is Parliament rejecting the deal and preferring to leave with no deal. Or if the government goes on being unable to swallow customs union and can't find any other negotiable way of avoiding a hard Irish frontier, and the 26 don't let Ireland down, and it's my prediction that they won't let Ireland down, there's no deal. But I can't see Parliament voting to go over the cliff like the lemmings. I really can't. So I think option 2, lemmings, the odds are very long, I think. Third, extra time, much shorter odds, much more plausible. The Commons don't like the deal, they don't like no deal, they ask the government to try again, keep on negotiating. Question then is, do the 27 agree to go on seeing Mr. Davies? Under the terms of Article 50, they all have to agree any extension of the 2-year negotiating period. And they are pretty bored of us now, so we can't be certain that they would. On the other hand, in my view, they probably would, because the cliff is bad for them too. It's worse for us, the legal chaos of no deal and the British leaving, but it's also bad for them. So in my views, much sucking of teeth, but probably there would be an extension. And so I think extra time is worth at least an each-way bet. Option 4 is a general election, which the odds on which are shortening in Westminster right now. It's not unusual if a government fails to persuade Parliament to approve the outcome of its central policy. Sometimes it feels these days as if it was its only policy. If it fails to carry Parliament, governments have in the past tended to think they'd better try and get a more compliant Parliament and better have an election. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act is no problem. I promise you, David Cameron thought it would be, but Theresa May had no difficulty at all in getting an early election. There is, at Westminster, there's a lot of money going on general election. I myself don't agree because I can't see her gambling again. She tried once, it didn't quite come off. People then say to me, but you're assuming it would still be her. And maybe it wouldn't be. Okay, that's option 4. Option 5 is my option. It's obviously the best option. Unfortunately, it's a completely unrealistic option. Option 5 is prodigal son. Prodigal son currently running at 100 to 1. It goes like this. Parliament, having looked over the cliff, decides to call the whole thing off and tell the government, to tell the 27, that we withdraw our Article 50 notification. Now, legally, we can. Legally, we can take it back, and there would be no political or financial price to pay for doing so. We would never have left the European Union, provided we take it back by the 29th of March next year. Therefore, the terms of our membership would not have changed. We would not lose our rebate. We would not lose any of the intricate fretwork of opt-outs and opt-ins that we've constructed over time. All would survive, provided we change our minds by March. And we know what the political reaction would be. If prodigal son turns up, the fatted calf is killed. No doubt. We've heard that from Macron, we've heard that from Merkel, we've heard that from Juncker, from Verhofstadt, from Rutte. They all agree that it's entirely up to us, but if we were to change our minds, we'd be delighted. They'd be delighted. Unfortunately, the snag is that I can't see any chance of the Commons summoning up the nerve to overturn the referendum result. It's Rousseau. Rousseau has crept in and wrecked a Burkean constitution. A large majority in the House of Commons, even larger majority in the House of Lords, would like to do so. But the Lords don't matter, and the Commons will not summon up the nerve. Once parliamentary democracy has been invaded by direct democracy, sticking to strict Burkean doctrine is not possible. In the hybrid system we've summoned into, the power of direct democracy hobbles the judgment of parliamentarians. So very long odds on prodigal son. I said 6. Yes, here we come to the 6th, and I think we may come to this one. The 6th is people's vote. This seems to me to be how Parliament could get out of the Rousseau-Burke conundrum. The Commons could decide that the deal, if it turns out different from that implied or promised in 2016, and it's certainly going to, the Commons could decide that it isn't what the people were told to expect, so the people should be asked, are you prepared to settle for this? Is this okay, or shall we stay? It has turned out, after all, that we can't have our cake and eat it. It has turned out that we can't have the exact same benefits from outside the club. It's turned out that Europe doesn't need us more than we need them. And it's turned out that the Irish frontier is a problem. So when the terms of the departure are known, maybe the country should be asked whether it still wants to depart. Having it the first word, shouldn't the people have the last word? Parliament might think so. It would get them off the hook. If we were to ask for an Article 50 extension in order to conduct a referendum, there's absolutely no doubt that we would get it. 27 democracies can't turn down a case resting on a requirement to have a referendum. Moreover, they all want us to change our minds. A referendum of the terms of the deal is, according to the polls today, now widely supported in the country. Not a referendum now, but a referendum when the terms of the deal are known. Last week's poll had 53% in favour and only 31% against, 65-22 among the under 35s, and interestingly, 69-18 among Labour voters. So this could be Mr. Corbyn's get-out-of-jail card. He doesn't have to declare deathbed conversion to the EU. He simply has to say, it's for the people to say. The government have made a mess. All opposition say that. In this case, it happens to be true. It's not what the Labour Party would have negotiated. I don't know if that's true or not. It's necessary for the people to have the last word. I think that it is not inconceivable that the Labour Party might move at their party conference this September to that position. Now, of course, all this could be cloud cuckoo land. The government may rally its forces, the deal struck in Brussels may be better than currently looks possible, and it may be possible for the government to force it through the Commons. And of course, it's also true that our 2019 referendum, and I think it would be June or September 2019, could have exactly the same result as last time. And there will be plenty of people who will be saying, oh, come on, we did all this. Why you ask us again? We'll vote the same way. So maybe I'm clutching at straws. But as I explained at the outset, I actually believe that Brexit would be such a historic geopolitical blunder and such a serious blow to the economy, hitting the poor hardest, and therefore such a disaster that one should actually try quite hard to avert it. So I think the people's vote, not sure what the odds are on the people's vote now, they are shortening. I think the people's vote campaign is worth your consideration and perhaps your support. Now, that's a pretty odd conclusion I've come to for somebody who admires Hume and Burke and dislikes Rousseau and referenda. But I think, under the circumstances, I think Hume might have understood. I'm quite sure that Adam Smith would have nodded along with my line on trade, customs union, and single market. And if Hume disagreed, he'd have done so very graciously, because he was such a very nice man. I'm very grateful for having had the honour of addressing his institute. Thank you.
Okay, your turn now. We have about 25 minutes for questions. We will do the normal thing of taking them in twos or threes. People who are particularly quick with their hands may get a bonus prize of being taken in a two rather than a three. You've been told about the novelty of the bouncing mic, so you need to be participants in helping each other ask questions rapidly. And for that reason, you will find that I geographically cluster the 2s and 3s to make this easier so that you're not bouncing it from the back to the front. We are being recorded. It would be helpful if you remembered to give us your name, and if you want to give us an attribution of where you come from, then that would be welcome as well. Over to you. Right, I have a neat line of 3 here, so we'll start at the front and work backwards diagonally.
Jim Gallagher, a member of the David Hume Institute, among other things. John, that was a tour de force. Thank you. That was absolutely splendid. And can I say one thing and ask one question? I agree with your diagnosis of the devolution shambles as part of the larger shambles. But I wonder if you would speculate on what I think will happen, which is actually a variant of kicking the can down the road or muddling through. It's perfectly plain that Mrs. May doesn't want to have a conclusion on the hard choices, and she is not ready to do that. She will seek to postpone it, as you say, into a blind Brexit. I wonder if Mr. Barnier mightn't agree with that, provided he gets the kind of backstop for Ireland, and possibly for the UK as well, which is to say, if we cannot agree the imaginary solution for customs and the single market, there will be a backstop of remaining. And when we do that, we'll do it by extending the transition and then eventually drifting into the EEA-type solution that you've sketched out. And I noticed that only yesterday Mrs. May suggested she would extend the transition in relation to the Irish question. So are we going to end up muddling through a familiar world? Next.
Anne Packard, member of the David Hume Institute and a passionate European. Given that the government failed to accept that it was an advisory vote, not a final vote in the referendum, what form of words would you suggest if it goes to a people's vote in order that there has to be a threshold of numbers of the electorate voting and a threshold for a result?
Mike Ash, a member of this institute. In all of your analysis and analysis that I've seen, it's always been assumed that the EU and the Commission and the countries that support the Commission have a fixed negotiating position. And yet, in some of the press that I accidentally look at, which might be fighting for the other side, so to speak, there is a kind of innate assumption that the so-and-sos will give way in the end. When they look over the cliff, they'll give way. Now, I fully support your analysis as an individual, but is there any credibility at all to the fact that if it came to a crunch, the Europeans might relent?
Shall I go ahead? Kicking cans down roads is all politicians' favourite sport. Yes, I think it extremely plausible, but there is a boring but quite significant Brussels objection. Article 50 is about voluntary withdrawal. It's about divorce. If you stretch the Article 50 legal base to include a period after you've left, remember that the transition starts once we've left. If you stretch it to include that, there are some lawyers who are starting to suck their teeth, saying that in that period, the 21 months after we've left, it's quite odd that that is still, the regime is still the regime of Article 50. If you then say that that transition period is not 21 months, but it's going to run, Mrs. May seems to be sounding as if it's going to run sine die. She certainly wanted it to be more than 21 months at the start, and she was pulled back by the 27 to 21 months. She's now back on wanting it longer. If I'm the Wallonian Parliament, which is not one of my current ambitions, but if I'm the Wallonian Parliament, I think I see my lawyer and I say, The treaty contains lots of articles on the conduct of association agreements or trade agreements with third countries. These Brits are going to be a third country. How come this is being done under Article 50, where I have no rights, because agreements under Article 50 do not require national ratification? It requires the European Parliament's approval. It does not require any national ratification procedure in the 27. Whereas if it was an association agreement or a free trade agreement or a deep and comprehensive whatever agreement between us and the European Union, the Wallonian Parliament would have their rights, which they exercised in the case of the agreement with Canada. The Dutch Parliament would have their rights, which they exercised in the case of the agreement with the Ukraine. The lawyers would say withdrawal, departure, must take place in a finite period. They seem to be agreeing that, okay, 21 months, you can call that departure. But sine die, I don't think it works. I also don't believe it works with the Brexiteers back home, because they fear this vassal state existence, where we observe all EU rules, though we no longer have a vote on them, no longer have a member of the European Parliament, no longer have a judge in the Court of Justice or a commissioner in the Commission. So it's plausible, but I'm not sure how you make it work. I think it might be hard to sell at home and impossible to sell in Brussels. On thresholds and size of turnout, size of majority in respect to referenda, well, I think we all did very badly last time. Yes, it clearly was advisory, but you can't stand up the morning after and say, well, okay, that's interesting advice, but yes, I think it should have had thresholds. We've had previous referenda with thresholds. We remember the 70s. Maybe the House of Lords should have tried harder. We certainly tried on the franchise to bring in the local government franchise in this country, which would have allowed non-British EU residents here a vote. And I think that would have been fair, because their interests are being very severely affected by the outcome. We would also have had UK residents in France, Spain, elsewhere in the 27, allowed a vote, and their interests are certainly being affected. So I don't think it was very fair that so few of them had the vote last time. We tried to vote into it, the Scottish franchise on 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. The government wasn't having any of that, and neither was the Labour Party at the time. It was unfashionable to bother about this, principally because the government were completely confident that they were going to win the referendum. They didn't need to bother about thresholds or playing with the franchise. It's the insouciance of David Cameron that really does still hurt with me. I think there's no going back. I think if we have another referendum, it will be impossible to have it on any different rules than the one before. Already, a principal argument against people like me is that I'm a Ramoner, that I'm not prepared to accept the verdict of the people and so on. If I was caught trying to manipulate the rules in a way that might be seen to help my side, I think the Daily Mail would really go for me, and not just me. Will the solidarity of the 27 hold? Well, we've been told from the word go that by the British government that it wouldn't. Remember that Mr. Davies' original position in July 2016 was that he wasn't going to go near Brussels. He was going to do the deal in Berlin over a weekend. It was also going to be the easiest negotiation ever, because we start from a position of complete convergence, so there's no problem. I think it is possible, but unlikely, that the solidarity of the 27 will crumble. At present, it has, up to now, it has worked in the opposite way from the way the British government would have expected. In every case, the draft presented by Michel Barnier to the Council of his mandate for the next stage of the negotiation has been toughened by the Council rather than softened. So I'm sure that all around the 27 British ambassadors have been scuttling in and out, explaining why the draft mandate was bad. They haven't done awfully well. I mean, in every case, it has gone slightly backward. The current mandate is for a negotiation that isn't happening on the future framework, where Barnier is ready to go and we don't know what we want to ask for, so we're not talking. There are some in Paris who say that, of course, you know, when at the crunch, if the Irish think that they can block big boys like us, they can think again. I don't think that's the case. I think the Irish can. I think if we don't move by the June European Council, I think there is a serious crisis. I think Mr. Varadkar's position is quite right. I think he feels that he can't wait to have the can kicked down the road into the transition period. He can't accept vague promises. I think he thinks he needs legal clarity before there's a deal. And the 27 so far have all said there are 3 bits of the deal, and if the Irish bit isn't there, there's no deal there. So I would expect them to stick together. We haven't helped by our blatant attempts to separate them, which have been pretty badly received, particularly as we've concentrated on the big boys. If we could turn around the French and the Germans, and the little boys all come to heel. Ho, ho, ho. What a wonderful way of annoying 25 countries.
Okay, right, this is going to be more of a challenge. We have one here, and we have 2 here, and 1 right at the back. So you can do the easy thing first.
Thank you, Lord Kerr. David Black, I have no affiliation. I was in the Court of Session the other day, 2 days ago, and noticed that David Johnson QC appeared to imply to Lord Boyd that if he granted the petitioners, who happened to be a number of MPs, MSPs, and 1 MEP,
I'm sorry, I'm not sure the microphone is working very well. I'm not catching it. I'm a bit deaf.
Is it on? Okay, I'll start again. I was in the Court of Session 2 days ago, and David Johnson QC for the executive in our 3 arms of government seemed to be implying to Lord Boyd that if he dared to grant the petitioners, who were members of Parliament, members of the Scottish Parliament, and 1 MEP, their wish to have elements of Article 50 refer to the ECJ, Lord Boyd might be breaking the law and might be guilty of a breach of the separation of powers. But it occurred to me, is this not what Mr. Johnson is actually guilty of when the executive is telling an independent Scottish judiciary what it can and cannot do in regard to Article 50?
My name is Donald Henderson. I've worked on various European policy issues over the last 20 or so years. On a slightly different topic, I wonder in whose interests is it to have a conversation with the 52% who may or may not be persuaded by the rationality that I'm sure is shared by almost everybody in this audience, and who felt that they were voting, giving voice to legitimate grievance regardless of the relevance of those grievances to actual European policy or European Union membership?
Yeah.
So second row from the back.
Thank you. Muir Dickey of the Financial Times. You said that you believe we are very close to a constitutional crisis. Can you tell us how you think that constitutional crisis, when it comes to the repatriation of devolved powers, might play out? And is it resolved if the Supreme Court rules that the Scottish Parliament's continuity bill isn't competent?
Shall I start with that one? You ask, can I tell you how it's going to play out? The answer is no. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert. The room is full of people who understand the devolution settlement much better than me. As I said, I think the government's first version of the EU withdrawal bill was a blatant breach of the central principle of the devolution settlement, that anything that is not reserved is devolved. It seems to me that the original text flew in the face of that. The text that is there now, well, I said that I thought it was a less blatant breach, which was a cunning diplomatic way of saying that I thought it looked still a bit like a breach. I'm not sure that I understand the Scottish response, the article in Council wrote. I have no idea how it's going to play out. It just feels to me very serious. We haven't been here since the devolution happened. And in these uncharted waters, we have a government which, in my view, has been tactless and undiplomatic in its handling of Scotland. Possibly Scotland has been undiplomatic in its handling of London. I don't know. I ducked out from answering your question in my speech by saying that we might have solved the problem. We might have found a solution in the House of Lords if the SNP had got away from the politics of Wendy Wood and blowing up telephone boxes and started to behave in relation to the House of Lords like a governing party. I think it is curiously self-harming not to send representatives to the House of Lords. Maybe it's the Groucho Marx approach to clubs. When you look at me, that's perfectly possible. On Article 50 and the legal case, I repeat, I'm not a lawyer. I am convinced that unilateral revocation is legal. Then why do I think it's a mistake to mount a legal case to find out what the Court of Justice in Luxembourg thinks about that? Two reasons. One, it creates doubt. I think there is no doubt we can revoke. I don't see any point in having a case which casts doubt on that. Second, there is no chance of getting an answer from Luxembourg until it's too late to effect. I bow to David Edward, of course, but it seems to me that the Court of Justice would be very likely to say that the last thing it's going to do is address a hypothetical question which is deeply political. Now, it is possible that, supposing one followed Kerr's option 5, the prodigal son route, and supposing a prodigal son galloped home, and the Prime Minister went to Brussels and said, I'm terribly sorry that you've been wasting 2 years, but actually I'm taking the letter back. The champagne is poured, the fatted calf is killed. Yes, it's possible, almost certain, since Europe is full of lawyers, there will be a lawyer among us who will say, I wonder if that was legal, let's find out. And 5 years later, in the Court of Justice, the Court of Justice will be asked, were the European Council acting intra vires or outre vires when they cracked the champagne and said, delighted to see you, to the British Prime Minister? Now, I think the Court of Justice isn't stupid, so it seems to me that it is extremely unlikely that the Court of Justice in these circumstances would rule that Kerr was wrong and the Prime Minister was wrong and the European Council was wrong, and it isn't irrevocable. So I see no point in a legal case. But I don't want to put the profession out of work. You know. On the very, very big question about the grievances of the 52%, I think I understand the underlying thought, and if I do, I completely agree with it. I don't think the referendum was basically about Europe. I think that the referendum was about 10 years of austerity, about real wages that have not risen for 20 years. I think the referendum was about the left behind. There's a sort of Trump and Brexit coincidence, or not total coincidence, but resemblance. I think it was about, there was a certain amount of misinformation from the Leave side, but I don't think that was central. I think it was, in part, a reaction to the 2015 election. I mean, David Cameron and George Osborne were not particularly popular, and yet, because of the collapse of the Liberal vote, they found themselves returned to power. But I think the country wasn't quite sure in 2015 that it wanted them to carry on. It certainly didn't want the Labour Party, but there wasn't a great surge of support for the Conservative Party. So I think in some ways it was a protest vote. Just as the French referendum result on my wonderful Giscard's wonderful constitutional treaty, the French threw it out because they had been obliged in 2004 to vote for Chirac. The French had not wanted to vote for Chirac, but they had no choice because the alternative was Le Pen. So it seems to me that the first question they were asked by Chirac following the election, the first referendum result, they were going to say no, whatever the question was. So a wonderful constitutional treaty went down the plug hole. But I actually thought at the time that the biggest single blow to my side's campaign, my side's amateurish, incompetent campaign, we'd get that right next time, I think, but the biggest single blow was the front page of the Mail, which contained no words, but just that picture of the little Syrian boy dead in the Greek policeman's arms on Lesbos. Now, either Paul Dacre is a really clever, I thought it was a brilliant first page actually, but I didn't realise at the time what its effect would be. People across Britain thought, if the EU can't even organise a refugee camp, can't even organise something that looks after these poor people, look at that poor dead little boy. I think that for 1%, 1.5%, 2%, that was a big factor, and that was in the last week of the referendum campaign. I agree. It would be very good if one could find an inspiring, positive story to write. I have been talking about the downsides of leaving. We will need, if we have another referendum, to have a quite different narrative, which is about the upsides, the positive, the things that one can do with the European Union. The last thing we should do, however, is to produce another draft of EU reform proposals. Remember, that was what Mr. Cameron was going to do. He never actually produced any proposals for the reform of the EU as a whole. He only produced proposals for further singularising and benefiting or exempting the United Kingdom. And he got a few of them, and it made not the slightest difference because it made no impact in the country at all. But they have heard enough of the British turning up saying that we'd like to come and reform you. The EU is working perfectly well without British reform proposals. It would work perfectly well without the Brits. It knows that. If we decide that we don't want to leave, we need to be a bit humble for a period.
Okay, I think we can squeeze in one more. So in the interests of geographical fairness, I think second row from the back on the right.
Thanks, John. Jenny Stewart, trustee of the Davis Hume Institute and partner at KPMG.
I'm sorry, I'm not catching it.
Oh, right. Is that any better?
Yes, that's better.
Great. So I'm Jenny Stewart. I'm a partner at KPMG and a trustee of the Davis Hume Institute. And I wondered, it would be great if you could say something about how you see the role of business playing out over the next 6 months. The role of business in the debate over the next 6 months.
Our business should
Contribute to the debate over the next 6 months.
Is that it?
That's it.
Well, it is the case that the CBI and the Engineering Employers Federation and the TUC all believe that we should be in a customs union and we should have an EEA-type arrangement with the single market. And they have said so publicly. I think business tends to hide behind the collective organizations. I think that's a pity. I think that what has most impact on MPs is local businesses, even very small businesses, writing to the MP, explaining what it sees as the effects. I have no doubt that the car industry in Britain will shrink quite fast if we have a Brexit. But it is a fact that Sunderland, where Nissan have their most productive factory in the world, was an area which voted very heavily to leave. Nissan didn't think it was any of their business to interfere in a British referendum. I think that's a mistake. It's an understandable mistake. Business wants to keep in with the government. The government believes its task is to ensure that Brexit happens. So the CBI tends to be concentrating on how to make it a soft Brexit rather than let's try and avoid a Brexit at all. I think that my advice to business would be write to MPs. It's particularly the constituency MP. Don't write to Anna Soubry or Ken Clark. Don't write to those who are convinced and are the front people. Write to the local MP on the potential effect, as you see it, of Brexit on employment in her constituency. That is the biggest single factor that changes people's minds in the House of Commons. Don't bother writing to any peers, they don't matter. But
Okay, I shall thank you for your stimulating questions and pass over to Professor Charlie Jeffrey for the vote of thanks.
Well, that wasn't a discussion where we heard many views that were in favour of Brexit. We know that Scotland voted 62 to 38 to remain. We know that Edinburgh voted 74-26 to remain. If there were a David Hume Institute constituency, I think we would be probably approaching North Korean. So there was a receptive audience tonight for an outstanding lecture from Lord Kerr, from John Kerr. We had in it a mix of tremendous experience, which we heard right at the start in those wistful recollections of when the UK was at the heart of things, when John was very much at the heart of things. We had lots of humour. I remember after one particularly trenchant point, John said, "You all recognise that I was a diplomat." And we had great erudition with Hume, Smith, Rousseau and others thrown at the big questions which lie before us about trading relationships,